This is not an accounting of the modern U.S. Navy SEAL teams. If that's what you're interested in, may I suggest you reach for one of the dozen or so recently published memoirs now crowding bookstore shelves everywhere. Instead, it is an attempt to explain a puzzle that no one ever has: the conclusive history of how and why the least likely branch of the service in the U.S. military came to foster the sort of unit it never should have needed, and more, the sort it should never have had the chance to create. This is a story of raids and raiders, of leadership and bravery, of inter-service rivalry, and unintended consequences. More specifically, it's a tale of well-meaning American soldiers and Marines forced to make decisions amid magnificent tragedies, some of which created gaps for admirals and sailors, with the foresight to tack into the wind of a rival's prerogatives, even when their ships ran out of water on which to sail. Best as I have found so far, this is the unlikeliest underdog story in American military history. It is also one whose beginning is decided, as is entirely appropriate, by the water. That is from the preface of By Water Beneath the Walls, The Rise of the Navy SEALs by Ben Milligan. This book, which focuses on the frogmen and UDTs of World War II, Korea, and Vietnam that would evolve into the SEAL teams, has been described as the Navy SEAL book we need. Ben himself served in the SEAL teams from 2001 to 2009. And in true, quiet, professional fashion, that fact never comes up in his book. Ben is the recipient of the Bronze Star, among other combat decorations. He lives in Chicago and is the father of 3 boys. Welcome to Notes from a Ghost, a podcast about stories and the people who tell them. My name is Charlie, and I'm a ghostwriter. I love a good story. I hope you enjoy this one. Ben, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Charlie. That took me, that was from the book. I was like, that sounds awfully familiar.
Oh yeah, I'm just ripping you off there. Yes. I remember when I read that, and it was like so refreshing. I was like, oh, this is cool. Like I know it for a really interesting read. It would, because you put it in almost as a disclaimer, if I remember.
Yeah, right.
Well, I guess before we even get into the content of the book, I was saving this question for later, but I guess it's worth addressing head on because that's what you do in the book. And that is kind of the phenomenon of SEAL books generally. And, you know, I had Stephen Pressfield on here a couple of weeks ago, and he said that there's nobody's ever going to complain about too many of the kind of books they love. And a Civil War buff is never going to say, oh no, another book about Antietam. They're going to be so excited. That was his example. And obviously, you know, you're following, like, there was when my dad's book came out a few years ago, it was kind of right after that raft of SEAL books. And the fact that this was like a Marine book about the Korean War we were very aware that it would sort of appeal to a similar audience, but it would be something different. I guess, how did you approach that choice of subject matter and your awareness of like where you were on that shelf or away from?
Yeah, right. It's a good question. I tend to be a little bit more forgiving of the SEAL books that have come out. Even though I did want to, say, first off, when I wrote the book, that this was a disclaimer. This isn't about me or anything like that. But I tend to say the same thing. Every time the issue of SEAL books comes up, and why do the question that I ask is, why do so many SEALs write books? As compared to Rangers and Marines and Delta Force operators. And the answer that I always give is, people buy the SEAL books. There's a it's a joke, but it's true. It's not like there are more SEALs out there that just hawking books, trying to get the public interested in them. There's a genuine interest. Publishers, publish SEAL books because it's a guaranteed sell. But that, I think, asks a bigger question. Why are people interested, in SEAL books? Is it, because of the training? It is the hardest, training that that definitely exists in the U.S. military, arguably in the world. But I don't. It's just training. Triathlons are really hard, but people don't write books about triathlons, or at least people don't, devour them like they do SEAL books. Um, I tend to think that it's a bit more about the actual mission itself. I mean, the mission of the SEAL teams is it's the broadest thing that exists in the U.S. military. I mean, there's no other unit that is supposed to have the ability to operate in as diverse a set of environments as the SEAL teams are. I describe in the book, the bottom of the ocean to the edge of the atmosphere. So it's a remarkable mandate, for any one institution to take on. So, but when I started to think about, what I was going to do, or what kind of book I wanted to write, I wanted to try and understand, that, where the SEALs, fall, and put some context, some texture to this institution. Why is the Navy involved in any of these types of missions? I mean, there's other naval commando units out there in the world that, have a, almost exclusively naval commando type role, but they specialize in combat swimmer type operation, or diving, or kayaking, those sorts of things. But the SEAL teams have they're just different. That seemed like a question worth exploring to me, and it became so interesting to me that my misgivings in writing a SEAL book were ultimately overcome. Because when I set out to write a book, I think if you're going to write a book, the first thing you have to decide is, well, I want to write a book. I don't think the topic, finds you, and you have to first, say, I want to write a book. I want to write a history book. And when I, was a younger guy, or when I was leaving the SEAL teams, and I started to think what I want the rest of my life to look like, and I started to think, what, I think I would really like to write. I would really like to write history books. The last type of book in my mind was a SEAL book. If it had been, if I had thought about, or if I had ever thought about writing a SEAL book before that, I would have paid more attention. I just hadn't. So I was focused on other topics, and it wasn't until I realized that I think part of the reason that I didn't want to write a SEAL book was because there were so many there's so many bad ones out there. I'd never read a good, and the more I thought about it, though, the more I started to realize that's not a problem; it's an opportunity.
I remember working with my dad. There were moments where I would use that to motivate him to write, because he would tell me about, oh, well, so-and-so wasn't really there, or so-and-so doesn't know what they're talking about. I'm like, but they wrote the book, so they get to be the one who tells the story. And I would sort of nudge him towards
right.
But one thing I'm wondering about, like, imagine it was the other way around, and you were, say, a historian, and you were going to write the exact same book, but you were not a Navy SEAL. You hadn't been to BUD/S. You're a civilian. Do you think that, like, what about the book would have been different, and what do you think would have been the same?
That's a great question. I don't think anybody's asked me that before, but it's a question that I've asked myself.
Oh, okay.
I don't think, definitely somebody that was not a SEAL written a book about the SEAL teams. I don't think that, and other people have tried.
Sorry, they couldn't have, or
no, they could. I think somebody who a non-SEAL could have written a version of this book, and I think it could have been great. I think it probably would have been different. I'm not sure that a civilian would have fallen upon the question that I fell upon, trying to understand why the SEALs have this broad mandate. I think they probably would have just come into the living room and accepted the furniture for where it was. They wouldn't have. They would have just started to describe what happened as opposed to trying to answer a particular question, telling, this happened and this happened and this happened, more of a comprehensive history as opposed to a targeted, history where telling a series of stories trying to get, the answer to a question. Now, I would say that there have been non-SEAL historians in the past who have, taken a run at this history and they've failed, primarily for the fact that, that they've been overawed by their subject. They have not been critical, or they have, everybody in the, every SEAL that they've covered is a hero, and they have, not wanted to take issue with any decisions that any of those folks have made. Where, on the flip side of that, though, you've had other SEALs that have written pretty extensive, autobiographies about themselves that are really not much more than just act grinding sessions against old teammates and old people, or, guys that they've had issues with. So I kind of recognized what, that issue pretty early on. And what protects you is you have to recognize, one, you've got a bias. You are interested in this institution. You are part of this institution. But that doesn't mean you can just let your bias run off, with the spoon, or, you've got to rein that in. Your objectivity is, your most important ally in this process. Which means you have to be critical about people that you might, really respect. And you have to take issue with decisions that they made, weigh them, against, decisions that other people were making. You might have characters that you are, overawed with yourself. But that doesn't mean that you can just let them, it doesn't let them off the hook. Like, take somebody like Bill Darby. Bill Darby was the legendary American Ranger. Half the things at Fort Benning in the Ranger Schoolhouse now are named after Bill Darby, and for good reason. He was a remarkable man, a remarkable leader, and the Rangers exist with him. But he, I had to be critical about him. He's the person, most responsible for the Rangers' success, but at the same time, he's probably the person most responsible for the Rangers being disbanded, or at least, the majority of Rangers being disbanded after the failure at Cisterna. And you have to be honest about that. I'm not sure that anybody has ever been honest about that before, but you got to check yourself too. You can't just say, that Daryl Cooper interview with Tucker Carlson a few weeks ago, where, he was, trying to give the world an entirely new, understanding of Churchill, and, recast Churchill as the villain in World War II. The whole idea is preposterous. I mean, insane.
Wow.
Man, such a lack of respect for, not only the person that you're writing about, one, but also the other people that have, taken serious looks at this history in the past. And just, if you had any sense of the historiography of, that have been written about Churchill, you would realize that, lots of other idiots have made the same mistake in the past, and you're just joining them now.
Sure. And that one seems to me especially insidious, because where I've seen that argument made is from like hardcore Stalin apologists, like people who want to rewrite Russian history where, Stalin's like a national hero or whatever.
That's ludicrous.
It's and weirdly, the reason you would be tough on Churchill in that understanding of history is because he was someone who saw right through Stalin. That's totally crazy. And it's weird too to think that history could be subject to, like, you could just reinvent it with clickbait and just throw out all the work that's been done to
but I mean, that's the that's the line you're trying to thread. You want to bring, a new perspective, a new look at the documents that you have, placing those in context and trying to be honest about, the faults and failures, and how those faults and failures, were consequential or, turned the hinge of history. While at the same time having a huge amount of humility with what you're dealing with, and then the characters that you're dealing with and the decisions they made, and placing yourself in the time those decisions were made. So that the tools of the historian, I might not be a credentialed PhD or anything like that, but all the same tools will apply. I'm doing the best I can to tell a story as opposed to write a history for the academy or anything like that. My focus is on the general reader. I want to take all the stuff that those really bright historians have produced and mined, and use a lot of the same documents, but present that to to a much bigger audience.
So one perspective on getting back to kind of what your own experience might have illuminated when you're looking at the historic record, and probably also talking to some of these people, which there's not too many years left where some of them are going to be available, sadly. But I'm wondering, did you see and for listeners at home, I'm sure there might be some people who don't know who the frogmen and the UDTs were. Tell me if this one sentence summary is accurate, and people are going to need to read your book to learn the whole story. But you're basically talking about the guys who went ahead of the beach landings in the Pacific and Normandy and Italy to basically see what was on the beach, get rid of obstacles, etc. And a lot of that work was done lightly armed or unarmed in swimsuits or crude wetsuits.
Yeah, I mean, the frogmen is a really broad term. We actually don't know exactly who came up with the first use of frogmen, but it was a term quickly picked up by just about every allied, even some Axis powers used the same moniker. But it referred to the Italian divers that were doing ship attacks, British divers. For the most part, I would say it refers to the underwater demolition teams in the Pacific, the individual, like you say, the traditional naked warriors, the guys that are swimming in with masks and swim fins and slates to either mark down the depth of various coral obstacles and then come back with explosives and blow them up. It's a term that persists to this day, generally to refer to SEALs and other combat diver type units, the Shayatek 13 in Israel, or the Kampfschwimmers in Germany, or Commando Hubert in France, or a variety. So there's a whole bunch that still use it. But yeah.
And you guys still learn a lot of those basic skills in the same way they were taught then, right? Like
pencil. Yeah, same thing. What's interesting about Bud's training, and Bud's is or SEAL training, and I don't think people quite realize this, but Naval Special Warfare as an institution is the oldest special operations institution that exists within the U.S. Military. And the Rangers were created in 1942, about the same time that Naval Special Warfare starts to come about. But the Rangers are disbanded in 1945. They're reconstituted in 1950, but they only stay alive for about 8 months. Now, there's a version of Rangers that exists during Vietnam, but they're really not reconstituted altogether until 1974. SEALs are created in 1962. So you could argue that Green Berets, precede the SEALs by 8 years, because the Green Berets were created in 1954. But Hell Week has, the crew that Naval Special Warfare or SEALs and SEAL precursors units have to go through. That's created in 1943. So it's the longest running special operations thing that we have. Yeah.
And I guess as someone who, you're a part of that history yourself and part of that community, and you're also chronicling the history of it. And I'm wondering, when you look back and study these people, met these people, did you see, was there continuity where there were like, and this might sound really like abstract, but like personality traits that are kind of consistent, where this guy might have been in the 40s underwater demolition, but he's basically like the guys you served with today? Or did the culture change with the mission through the years and you have a different
Yeah,
character?
you can see, it's tough. It's like trying to understand why, your son acts a certain way. Is because his grandfather acted the same way, or is he just his own person and he's also, just as, pig-headed or funny or whatever. We tend to, find attribution, even retroactively. But having said all that, it's a huge disclaimer. I would say yes, there do seem to be traits that continue to exist in today's frogmen or today's SEAL teams that are, I would say, echoes of traits that existed when those units were created in World War II. And I think a lot of that is because, the training is roughly the same. I mean, you have, like I said, Hell Week is created in 1943. Planners think it's insane when it's created. They try to get rid of it. Draper Kaufman, who creates the thing, he demonstrates that it's possible to do by putting himself through the course, which in itself is a great story. It's remarkable. And, it's one of the more fun aspects of the book for me to write about. But that has to, creating a course like that, or, putting people through a course like that, it's going to make people similar. I mean, it's almost an impossible course. The idea that you're going to have a 5-day long, incredibly difficult, every hour is incredibly difficult. It's incredibly cold. The idea that, you have guys that are going to their brains are going to get rewired, in order to accomplish this. They're going to have to, come up with new pathways in their brain to accomplish, what seems impossible. So you can't help but think that, like guys that are going through Marine Corps boot camp, they come out stamped with a certain imprint. Guys that go through, an experience like that are probably going to be pretty similar, no matter when they go through it. So I do see that, and for good and bad. I mean, there were definitely characters that I came across, interviewed, whose letters I read and ransacked from the Vietnam period. Whether Dick Marcinko or some other guys, and they are, they're very much like SEALs that exist today. There are I say it in the book. There's two kinds of frogmen. There's the self-effacing and the self-promoting. There's the quiet warrior, and then there's the guy who's out there beating his own drum, as loudly as he can. Yeah, I mean, they're like everything is about the SEAL teams, and their personality is defined by it. They were the greatest frogmen to ever live, and all the rest. And it's exhausting, but just because they're exhausting doesn't mean they weren't great SEALs. There are guys out there that I served with who are, very loud, and very obnoxious and annoying, but, were they great frogmen? Yeah, they were. A obnoxious, self-promoting person can, be a great combat frogman. So
a friend of mine, and I'm in no way comparing like civilian kayaking to frogman activities, but I was out in the middle crossing Dingle Bay, which you've been to, so you've seen how kind of vast that water is. And I was out there with a friend, and we were in the middle of a 3-hour crossing with it was okay. The conditions were like letting us get across, but you're never relaxed in a place that's that exposed. And we were just chatting away about kind of where your head goes on a crossing like that. And it was like we hadn't spoken much that day, and we broke the silence and we were talking. And I forget how he said it exactly, but he's like, you don't go do something like this because you're just, everything at home is fine and you're totally content with just a normal life. And And so he's like, don't be surprised when there's abrasiveness or whatever. And because it was like he and I had a very, like, we just, it just works on the water. But there were moments earlier that day where I'm like, dude, you can just tell me to shut up when you're sick of like hearing from me. Like, that's okay. But yeah, it was, we were both in that place because there was everything on offer on land kind of didn't scratch that itch for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Um,
I would, you say something, you said something at the beginning of where you said you wouldn't compare anything that you've done with, the experience that a SEAL experiences. And I think that's one of the reasons that I think a civilian would come at this topic, with some reticence. But you remember that, that the SEALs didn't invent any of this stuff, or Naval Special Warfare didn't invent any of this stuff. And to undercut yourself like that, I think is, it's not, it's not deserved. The SEALs didn't, invent Hell Week. The NFL in part invented Hell Week. I mean, the NFL, invents, so many of the individual activities that Hell Week ultimately becomes. It's really just one person that comes in and takes, this 8 weeks worth of calisthenics exercise and is like, I like all this, but we're just going to compress it into 5.5 days. You definitely have, with your experience in the water and your experience as a kayaker and waterman, you have a lot to offer. And when it SEALs, even today, I would say the reason that the SEAL teams became what the SEAL teams ultimately became, incredible in Vietnam, is because they were willing to reach out, in part in many ways to civilian experts and bring them in to learn their techniques, to make themselves better. Now, I think, at least when I was in, there was a much more wagon circling period where, yeah, we've learned all that. We know everything. Green Berets, Delta Force, they don't have anything to offer us now. We're at the top of our game. I think that's the absolute wrong attitude for that community to have, though. You have to remember, and hopefully, if anything, this book does that. This book reminds, an entire generation of folks, we didn't invent this. If anything, we aggregated it, or the NSW aggregated it. And, remember that the path to NSW's future might be from without, not from within. So.
And that's interesting. Wow. That's very cool to hear. And I guess, there's a couple things there that are really interesting. I think one of them is probably like where I would feel the need to disclaimer anything where I'm borrowing some, say, stuff I learned in a SEAL book or whatever, I think is probably as much the social media side of it, where it's like, because you say, oh yeah, there's this thing about how to survey a nautical chart for landings that I learned from a book on SEALs or whatever. To say that is not to say, and therefore that's how tough I am, or that this trip is like going to war or whatever. You're saying that this very niche piece of knowledge that kind of isn't widely practiced in like civilian world, there's these folks who sort of perfected it. I have a couple of questions actually on the because there's one swim coach actually where I read what is his name? Is it Couch? That guy who he himself is a SEAL and he wrote a book about
Dick Couch.
Dick Couch. And he was talking about Terry Laughlin, who was a total immersion swimming. He was like a civilian swim coach. Found, and I've done a bit of it, and it's incredible how it improved. Because I'm like not like a big enough to do short swimming. I do like when in a pool of 1,500 or I do sea swimming, and it's this like low intensity stroke. And I guess in Dick Couch's book, he said that coaching improved the pass rate in BUD/S from swimming events, because
that's interesting.
The way he described it, it made it sound like people were just muscling their way through before, people who say hadn't like swum or done
Yeah.
polo or whatever. Because I know like I used to be someone where I would just get out of breath, but I was out of breath because I wasn't gliding, and I had to learn how to move through the water. And it's this one guy. I think he was from San Francisco or something. He was obsessed with efficiency in the water. He studied like the hull design of ships to try to see if that could improve his
Interesting.
front crawl stroke. It's a great. He has a book on it. It's really like, you know how on the hull, like the bow of a ship goes out in front, like below the waterline.
Mm-hmm.
He compared that to the lift you can generate with your front crawl, where you enter the water, but then your hand continues underwater. And that combination of that, just like pushing against the buoyancy of your own lungs, like trims you in a better way. But yeah, anyway, I was really, it was kind of exactly what you were saying, that there was a need for knowledge that existed in the civilian world. And I think there's been a real exchange, because there just isn't a lot out there on breath holds, on cold exposure. And a lot of it comes from you guys.
Maybe. I mean, I still would say most of what we know has been gotten from other folks. But that's interesting that you say that about Vic. I've always been impressed with good swimmers, because I was such a bad one in buds, and I barely made it through. I was always the guy that, failed the first several swims in every phase of training, and then managed to pass the last two just to graduate to the next phase. It wasn't until, towards the end of that training that I actually figured it out, and went from being the worst swimmer in the class to one of the better ones.
Oh wow!
But only because of guys that were willing to work with me on the weekends. Just Master Chief Rick Nepper, who was I ended up looking. I didn't write about Master Chief Nepper, but I looked at several of the platoons that he was a part of, and it's interesting when you circle back on this institution, how many of the guys that you knew casually, or brushed elbows with, they ended up realizing how important these guys were at a different period, and
there was something in your book where you talked about, I think it was a study that was commissioned about, was it the psychology of the UDT?
Oh yeah.
It sounded like real like McCarthyism.
Oh yeah, but
of like, we got to make sure these guys aren't psychos.
There. I mean, and that's not unique. I mean, they, like I said, earlier, the planners were very skeptical of SEAL training in the beginning. They thought, this is insanely, the attrition rate is too hard, and it doesn't need to be this hard. Well, of course, what the NCDUs were able to accomplish on Omaha Beach D-Day proved that the training was as hard as it needed to be. It was sufficiently impossible, to train these guys for an impossible mission. But as you progress out of World War II, and the likelihood of more Omaha Beach type missions, is fading, it's in the rearview mirror. Planners were right to, or maybe not right to, but they were naturally skeptical of this training. Why do we have it if we don't have this type of mission anymore? And we you're losing what appear to be so many of the best candidates. So they. But that wasn't the only instance. I found, the first instance that I found of the Navy's skepticism of this training was in roughly 1953, 54. But then I would progressively find it just about every 10 years. There'd be another CNO that would come in, and he would be just as, irritated or skeptical about, UDT training, or eventually SEAL training. And would want, the Navy to take a serious look. We're in a period like that right now. We had a few years ago, we had the death of a Bud student, after Hell Week, and people are naturally and probably rightly critical. and want some answers. But I would, I've tried to, tell the community this is not the first time that this skepticism has happened. The issue is just, the SEAL, the community really needs to explain, why the training exists in the first place, and also remind them that it wasn't the SEALs that created this. It was the Navy that created this. There's this myth, perpetuated, from book after book by various SEALs that come around. Probably the most popular being the one by Dick Marcinko, where he's, says that the SEAL teams, were created, against the Navy's, wishes. The Navy didn't want the SEAL teams. It was enterprising, UDTs that sort of forced the Navy to do this. Couldn't be further from the truth. The UDT wanted to stay in the water. The UDT didn't want to create a new organization. It was the Navy's conventional leaders that saw the opportunity, for a unit like this. It was the Navy's conventional leaders that pushed the UDT into creating this program. So I think if the Navy, if Navy planners knew this, or if Navy planners, had finally threw up their hands and decided, okay, we're going to get rid of, the SEAL teams, within 5 years, the Navy would recreate them. The Navy needs the SEAL team more than the other way around.
And it sounds like, and we've touched upon this, and you mentioned even just how everything from like how difficult BUDS is, to the necessity of this special mission, to even just it being the Navy's business. The common denominator running through all of that, and it seems to be water. And imagine like you remove the water. Is BUDS suddenly not the hardest training? Because if it's just a running and push-ups and, I don't say just, but.
No, yeah. If you remove the water and you remove the, you've got a version of the Q course, or your version of Ranger School. It's not, the water is the, even though the SEAL teams like to, imagine itself of having a foot in both camps, 1 foot in the water and 1 foot, on the shore. The water is the indispensable component of training, and it's and I would argue that it's the, it's not just the medium, that tests, future candidates, but it's also, it has structural after effects, or structural effects on the institution as a whole, in good and bad ways. I mean, the bad, starting on the any maritime special operations force is going to have a natural disadvantage over their ground focused or ground based competitors. They're not going to have the obvious reason to be there, reason to be in a ground war. Why? I don't know how many SEALs have had similar experiences of being in Iraq or being in Afghanistan, where they got looks from their Army peers that were just wondering why there was a Navy unit on a mountain in Afghanistan. So there's that natural disadvantage. You're going to have to find those opportunities for them. But there's also inherent advantages in having a special operations force that has that maritime DNA. It's this concept of decentralized command. It's something that the Army and the Army specifically, Marine Corps to a lesser degree, but the Army specifically, it's something that the Army has to work at. This idea that you can have a unit that has is full of initiative, and can adjust on the fly and adapt to unforeseen circumstances. That's something that Army planners don't quite know how to do, or they know how to do it, but it's like it's like a second language to them. Whereas Navy units, there's never been I always like to say there's never been a Army unit that has been further than one horseback ride away from its chain of command. The Navy, the Navy throughout its history has given skippers a set of expectations or mission type orders. They've sent them over the horizon. There's no communication between vessels, and they have to accomplish those missions overseas. And so, by giving these units this wide latitude to accomplish their missions, there have also been, commensurately high expectations that have come with that. You can't let these units with wide latitude just run off the rails. They have to be contained. That's why the Navy specifically, has such a different, fundamentally different approach to leadership. That's why if a skipper, that's why a commanding officer of a ship, if his ship runs aground, even while he's asleep, he's getting fired. He doesn't even have to be on the deck, or he's not even in command. He's asleep. How could he, be in charge or responsible for that? Well, he's not necessarily, but he's accountable. That's why we have. That's how the Navy, that DNA is in the SEAL team. So,
and I mean, there's the sea is the home of unforeseen circumstances. I mean,
absolutely.
And that was kind of my other nautical big picture question, and that is, I mean, it goes without saying that war is full of danger. Like, of course it is. But on top of that, you are adding, and maybe in some ways compounding that with the dangers of operating small boats, weather, the sea, all those things that those, again, if we're to go back to the Buds example, without the water, it's an obstacle course, but with the water, it's totally dangerous to do those things recreationally as a surfer or a sailor or what have you. Even in a pool, like, you don't do free diving on your own. And I'm wondering about the kind of cultural ramifications of that. I mean, I know not long ago you folks lost 2 people to what I understand to be a man overboard. Again, I don't know all the details. I just know what I read in the news. But, that's something that can happen on any vessel going to sea.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. It's an unforgiving environment, and I suppose that's why training is just the way that it is. That episode in particular was that was.
And by the way, I'm sorry to almost bring it up rhetorically.
No, it's all right. I didn't.
For all I know,
I didn't know them. No, I didn't know them. I had been invited to speak to SEAL Team 3 right before they deployed, and it was one of those opportunities that it was neat, getting getting a chance to go back and talk to these guys before they deploy. And right now there's such a with the drawdown of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, it sort of left the SEAL teams and all special operations, or all American special operations, with this, well, what now? What do we do now? And then naturally, the one idea that a lot of planners have is to look backwards and look over their shoulder and see how others have done it, because this isn't the first time that it has felt like we're on the precipice of something, but we don't know exactly which direction we're going. And so a lot of folks have been drawn to this book for that, those reasons. They want to see how folks have done it in the past. And I spent a lot of the time in the book not just covering the wars, but those interwar periods where, a lot of the developments, a lot of the, the imagination comes into play. And in this instance, I was uh, they, I think um, there's been an emphasis or I think a lot of folks have wanted to say that, this is the direction we're going. This is the new adversary. Uh, and and whenever we've done that in history, we've always been wrong. No one has ever predicted, correctly, where we're going to fight. And if they have, predicted where we're going to fight, they haven't predicted how we're going to fight. All of those, we're humans are good at one thing. It's being wrong about, what the future holds. And, when I spoke to SEAL Team 3, I think they had an expectation of what that plan was going to be like. And that's certainly an event like that was certainly not in um, something they anticipated. But yeah, I mean, the environment of, um, it's a powerful reminder, um, considering that, naval special warfare has in large part been at war in desert and mountain environments for the last 2 decades. Just how complicated this is, this maritime problem, and it. Fortunately, I mean, for better or worse, these are lessons learned that hopefully won't have to be learned again. The mistakes that were made. I mean, hopefully we don't remake those mistakes. We'll just go on and make new ones. But
there's you think of that that hymn that in the U.S. Navy and the
sure,
the lifeboat service over here actually share it, but that those in peril on the sea, and you notice there's no hymn for mountains or canyons or there is something so uniquely I mean, hazardous is almost the wrong word, but alluring, but also hostile to human existence out there.
Yeah. Be curious. I'll be interested to see what's over the horizon for the next group.
Well, I think your book is I'll be interested to see in how that's going to influence people's thinking about this problem you're talking about.
Yeah, that's interesting. I spent a lot of time, in my Korean War period, looking at The Naked Warriors, which was a book written by Francis Doug Fane, who was he was one of the leaders of the underwater demolition teams during the pre-Korea period and then during the Korea period. And he was one of the thought leaders of the community, and he predicted that the UDT's future was going to be under the waves, not above the waves or beyond the waves, but under the waves. And he spent a lot of time, reorienting the UDT towards that problem. And he was hard to argue with. One, he was a opinionated guy, big drinker, big personality, and he had a lot of ammunition, at his disposal. He wrote this book about the history of the UDT. So more than anybody else, he had at his tips the entire history of the community in his head. And so how do you argue with somebody who's so, as knowledgeable as he is? And he was 100% wrong. He was wrong about the future, wrong about, what the country needed, from a force like this. There's this idea that we can bootstrap history. We can make use of it and, learn all the lessons to, avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. If that was true, I would be a lot richer. Those of us that, spend our lives, looking backwards, it's not, there's opportunities in history, absolutely. And you can avoid some minefields, but like I said before, you might avoid some minefields, but you're going to find others. I think one thing that you can get from history, though, is this, is wisdom, this mass, it's so important, to take from history, just this big amount of humility. and recognize that, as much as you think you're right in this moment, you're not all right. And as much as that person over there is wrong, they're not all wrong. And there's the truth of the situation is more than likely someplace in the middle.
I'm kind of hoping that what you said goes viral ahead of the election for people out there just eviscerating each other on social media.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I want to wrap up. I want to ask you about something. You posted, so right now my main writing project is related to the 9/11 responders and some of the illness they've had to deal with and the difficulties there. And we've done a couple podcasts about that community. I don't know when this episode's going out, but we're recording it kind of right after the Remembrance Week of 9/11. And I don't know whether it was last year, that time, or a couple of years ago, but you posted something that I shared with a bunch of people and I saved it. And I kind of want to read it back and just hear what you have to say, because I thought it was talk about kind of a take that gets into the nuance and kind of goes against some prevailing chest thumping. But so you wrote, sometime after 9/11, Colonel David Grossman, author of On Killing, penned an essay that divided the human race into three categories: sheep, wolves, and sheepdogs, the latter group being those in law enforcement and the military who volunteer to protect the weak from evil. It's an analogy I've always hated, not because I think that law enforcement officers and military members aren't worthy of this distinction, quite the contrary, but because I hate how it suggests that those who don't choose those professions are little more than prey in waiting. To me, nothing proves the folly of this analogy as the actions of civilians on 9/11, none of whom had any warning that this would be their last day, many of whom decided they would not go down without a fight. For anyone that might need a refresher on the courage of everyday Americans, may I suggest a rereading of the transcript between the 9/11 dispatcher and Todd Beamer, just moments before he led a small group of passengers to retake the cockpit of Flight 93 before the terrorists could crash it into the U.S. Capitol. Todd Beamer was a software salesman. I mean, besides being a very fine piece of writing and a moving one, I mean, yeah, say more about that kind of the way we write heroism and the way we talk about it.
It's been a long time since I remember writing that.
I hope I didn't make you cringe. I know how it is to reread something.
No, I think it still holds true, and I'm glad that it still holds true. You never know how something you write is going to stand the test of time. But and the sentiment that it expresses, I think, is I see. I don't know. Lately I've been, I took a detour recently to explore an area of research that I'm ultimately not going to pursue. But it was I spent a lot of time looking at some of the active shooter type situations that we've experienced over the past, and looked at Columbine, I looked at Uvalde, and I looked at the officer response to those incidents, and I shouldn't say the officer response, the officer lack of response, the abject failure of it. And we give a lot of credit to law enforcement and the military, and that doesn't, it's all justly deserved, but just because you have one of those professions doesn't necessarily mean that you've got the market cornered on courage, as those incidents, shout from the rooftop. And just because you don't choose to join the military or join law enforcement doesn't mean that you don't know anything about courage. There's courage all around us every day, and I don't know. I've seen my dad is a surgeon. He was a ear, nose, and throat surgeon. I've seen, you don't have to spend a long time in medicine or in the world of medicine. I grew up in and around that world, to realize how the folks in those professions are making life and death decisions every day. And it takes us, just a lot of courage to make some of those decisions. But I don't know. I I like to read, and I like to read widely. I read a story about the ambassador Herrick. He was the ambassador to the U.S. Or to the American embassy in France during the First World War, and there was, when the Germans were ready to invade, and the French government is packing up all of its belongings and it's getting ready to flee Paris because they don't want to be under siege again and possibly frog marched out and executed by these German thugs that are about to conquer Paris. Ambassador Herrick receives a cable from Washington telling him to follow the government into exile, and he refuses. He refuses to give up Paris, and he commits that he's going to meet the German army ahead of in front of the Louvre to prevent them from ransacking it. It's not the Louvre, but I can't remember, in front of the monuments. And the amount of courage that it took just to disobey that order. He's not a military person. He was a businessman before he was an ambassador. I don't know. I think there's nothing, I think, more remarkable than those, folks that, show courage, when they've had no training. There's that's remarkable to me.
Mm. And I think that goes back to, you talk about the marketability of certain stories and what is essentially compelling about them. And I think that those will, because I think that in some ways that's how we learn how to be brave, because like maybe I'm never going to have to like single-handedly defend the Louvre. But I can learn something from the guy who did. And maybe that's standing up for myself, standing up for my family, and doing the right thing in a small way.
Yeah. I mean, most of these choices are small choices. I think, I think the one thing we don't talk about with, because we've had a crisis of suicide in the that has plagued so many folks that have served in special operations. I think there is an under talked about aspect of that, and I think it's it's this in whatever deployment you're on, whatever firefight you're in, you have 100 moments where you have to make a decision, and those decisions are in some instances you have to you have a decision: am I going to expose myself to do something that has to be done, or do I is discretion in this instance the better part of valor, and do I hold where I am for a moment and wait for another situation to develop? And I think those if you come back from enough of those deployments, and you have enough of those second guessing moments to yourself that maybe nobody else knows, maybe you had what others would say is a career of nothing but unparalleled courage, but in your heart that you've had those how many of those decisions have you not measured up to, at least in your own head? And I came across, I don't know how many guys and that I covered, one standout being Red Mike Edson, from who was in many ways the Chesty Puller before Chesty Puller was the Chesty Puller legend. He was he was awarded the Medal of Honor. He had David Cross. He was a hero from Guadalcanal, hero at Tarawa, and he he comes back from World War II, and he by all counts, he's doing great. And one night he just comes home and locks himself in the garage and doesn't turn the car off. Who knows? I mean, what was going through his head, but there's I don't know. It's this idea of courage. It's not measuring up to it in your own mind. I think um, is that can be insidious.
Mm. Yes, especially when, I mean, you talk about discretion as the better part of valor. I mean, sometimes the courageous thing could be to pick up the phone and call a friend, or to admit that you're having a bad time or you're going through something.
Yeah, very few people do.
Well, something I like to close every interview of any kind I do is to ask, is there anything you wanted to cover that I didn't bring up or that we didn't get into?
I can't imagine a person out there that wants to hear more from me.
No way.
I appreciate the offer.
Love it. No, I mean, like, but when I read your book, it was like, yes, like finally, this isn't a footnote. Now we're getting like the whole thing and it's all about the the water. And is if you had kind of infinite writing time, you could write all the books you ever want. Is there a topic that you just know you're never going to write about, but you kind of would if you had the time or the like?
Oh gosh, yes. Yeah, I could do a whole podcast on this. There's a whole bunch of topics. I keep a list, everything that I want to write about. I don't have time, or I don't have the. I've pitched so many different books. I've pitched Napoleon books. I've picked Civil War books to my agent. A lot of my agent is he's good sounding board, and he mostly just says no. I had a moment with General Mattis not long ago, and I asked him a version of the same question. I said, sir, what's a book out there that you really want to read that doesn't exist? Like, what's the book, I think that's a good exercise for you to go through as a writer. Like, what's a book that, you want to read as a reader, but just doesn't exist? And he came up with a very interesting answer. I won't tell you what it is, but there's there's no shortage of them. I find though that, when I do get an idea for a book, I, very quickly, go, either on Amazon or another website, and I Google, and find. I recently was trying to find a book, not on Napoleon, but on Napoleon's marshals, and sure enough, there were 15 different books of Napoleon's marshals, and I found one that I recently started that is just it was the oldest one that I found. I think it was written in the 30s or 20s, and I'm only 10 pages into this thing, but it's fantastic.
Oh, that sounds great. And is it an English language originally, or is it translated?
Yeah, it was written by I think he was a British MP, and he was a veteran of the Somme himself. So he was writing in the 10, 15 years after the First World War. But it's excellent.
Wow, that sounds.
A.G. McDonald is his name. But I just started it. We'll see if it holds up.
Cool. Amazing. Well, Ben, thanks for taking the time. I think we could be here a long while if we got into history reads.
Not without some booze, but sure.
Right. Yeah. Oh man. Cool. Well, thanks again. That was awesome. And
Thanks, Charlie.
I'll be sure to link to the book in the show notes. And yeah, thanks again.
Thank you.
If you have an epic story, I'd love to hear it. You can find me at dailyprose.com or on LinkedIn. My links and Ben's are in the show notes. Thanks for listening.